All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our AI Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, Mark Name, and I'm joined by my co-host, Becky. Becky, how you doing today?
Hey, Mark. I'm doing great. Excited to dive into some classic wrestling moments. We have some legendary events to talk about today. How about you? Ready to jump into the world of late 80s wrestling?
Absolutely. Sure am, Becky. So let's get things kicked off. So today, guys, we're going to talk about wrestling in the late 80s, specifically Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage, the Mega Powers, and how they rose to prominence and what led to their demise. So let's get started right away at WrestleMania 4. Becky, how do you think Savage did in the tournament overall? We know he faced four opponents. He went against Butch Reed, Greg Valentine, the One Man Gang, and of course Ted DiBiase in the finals. Which performance did you think stood out the most from a pure wrestling perspective?
Oh, man. Savage was on fire at WrestleMania 4. If I had to pick one performance that stood out, I'd say his match against Greg Valentine really showcased his resilience. The Hammer was known for his brutal, methodical style, and Savage had to dig deep to outmaneuver him. But what do you think, Mark? Which match do you think was his shining moment?
I fully agree. Look, from a pure wrestling perspective, him and Greg Valentine was money and it was magic. It definitely was the better match from a mechanical and functional standpoint. But do you think Macho Man made any major mistakes that night across all his four matches? And if so, what were they?
Considering the high stakes and the grueling nature of the tournament, I think Macho Man held up pretty well. One could argue, though, that he took a bit too much damage early on, particularly in his match against Butch Reed. That might have made his later matches tougher than they needed to be. What do you think? Did Macho Man make any mistakes that caught your eye?
Yeah, I mean he did prove that he was an Iron Man for sure in those four matches, and it was unprecedented to that time that he was able to go that route. So I don't think any major mistakes. I think when he went against the One Man Gang, he did make a few errors when he was jumping off the top rope and just mechanical things. But overall, I agree. I think he did really well. So of course we know the outcome of WrestleMania 4. He goes to the finals against Ted DiBiase. He defeats Ted DiBiase to win his first WWF championship. Of course, Hogan came to ringside to help him out because Andre, the Giant, was at ringside to help Ted DiBiase. So that essentially was the initial formation of the Mega Powers on the big stage. Big celebration at the end. Let's fast forward to SummerSlam 88. Becky, tell me about the ending of that match. What were your thoughts, and did you see any seeds planted at the end?
SummerSlam 88 was electric, especially with the Mega Powers teaming up for the first time on pay-per-view. The way Hogan and Savage worked together against the Mega Bucks, Andre the Giant and Ted DiBiase, was something else. But yeah, if you look closely, you can see a bit of tension brewing. The ending was pretty wild, with Miss Elizabeth's distraction tactic and Hogan's over-the-top celebration with Elizabeth. You could sense a little unease from Savage, especially with Hogan's closeness to Elizabeth.
For sure, absolutely. And this was one of my favorite tag team main events of all time. But this was also the first time, as you said, we saw that animosity starting and Macho Man kind of giving Hulk Hogan that look, right? Planting the seeds for what was to come. So they were able to win there, which was pretty awesome. Moving on to Survivor Series 88, the story continues as the Mega Powers move on to continue dominating the wrestling scene. So just to bring everyone up to speed, can you discuss, Becky, how this match ended?
Survivor Series 88 had the Mega Powers leading a team against the Twin Towers, which were Akeem and the Big Boss Man, along with their allies. The match ended with Hogan and Savage emerging as the survivors for their team. The big takeaway here, though, was the continued subtle tension between Hogan and Savage. There was a moment where Hogan celebrated a bit too enthusiastically with Miss Elizabeth again, which didn't sit well with Macho Man. This event kept building the storyline, showing that while they were dominant as a team, there was some underlying tension brewing between them. What's your take on that,
Yeah,
Mark?
they did a tremendous job. I mean, the storyline here and the way the story played out, to me, is one of the greatest storylines in wrestling history. But how irate do you think Macho Man was at this point? He kept on looking over at Hogan. He's seeing him celebrating with his manager. Like, there was a lot of tension.
Oh, for sure. Savage was definitely irate by this point. You could see it in his body language and those intense glares. It was like a slow burn, with each event adding fuel to the fire. Macho Man was a fiercely proud and intense competitor, and seeing Hogan getting a little too close to Elizabeth was really starting to grate on him.
For sure,
It set
for sure. So, fast forwarding to Royal Rumble 1989, do you think it was intentional that Hogan eliminated Savage, or do you think it truly was an accident?
That's the big question, isn't it? Given the mounting tension between them, it's hard not to wonder if Hogan had some ulterior motive. Hogan tried to play it off as an accident, but Savage was livid, and it really escalated the tension between them. So, while it might have been a genuine mistake, it sure didn't look good, and it added more
Right,
fuel to.
right, absolutely. Yeah, added more fuel to the fire for sure. Um, let's go to the next month, as Saturday night's main event, as things keep progressing in the story. What's your key takeaway on the events that took place on this night between, of course, it was the Mega Powers against Akeem and the Big Boss Man? What are your thoughts, Becky? What can you share with our audience?
Saturday night's main event in February '89 was a pivotal moment. During the match, there was a spot where Savage was thrown out of the ring and landed on Miss Elizabeth, knocking her out. Hogan carried her to the back for medical attention, leaving Savage to fend for himself for a while. When Hogan came back, Savage was furious, feeling abandoned. This led to a heated confrontation in the locker room, with Savage accusing Hogan of trying to steal Miss Elizabeth from him. It was clear at this point that the partnership was hanging by a thread. This night really set the stage for their explosive showdown at WrestleMania 5. What's your take, Mark?
Yeah, this definitely was it. That was the culmination of the relationship ending. It was the exclamation mark on "It's over. We're no longer tag team partners." Macho Man was clearly done with Hulk Hogan. It was a pretty epic evening, and especially with Elizabeth getting hurt, and it was on late night Saturday night. Like, there was lots going on at that time. And like you said, going to WrestleMania 5, the train was in full motion, full steam ahead, and the stage was set. So this is one of my favorite WrestleManias of all time, and this is one of my favorite matches of all time. I was just a kid watching this live on pay-per-view back in 1989. Where would you rank this, Becky, in the top matches that Macho Man has had in his career?
WrestleMania 5 is definitely up there in the ranks of Macho Man's best matches. It's iconic not just for the in-ring action, but for the storytelling and the emotional stakes. Savage brought everything to the table: his athleticism, his charisma, and that raw emotion that made the storyline with Hogan so compelling. I'd say it's definitely one of his top matches, right alongside his WrestleMania 3 bout with Ricky Steamboat, which is often hailed as one of the greatest matches of all time. But WrestleMania 5 had that special magic, especially with you watching live as a kid. Where does it rank for you?
Yeah, it sure does. It's definitely a top 5 match for me, and I love Macho Man, how he busted out with the bright orange tights for that as well. So top 5 for sure. I guess, as we come to the end here, the Mega Powers exploded. Hulk Hogan wins the title. Macho Man goes off, frustrated and upset. The storyline would continue there. But hey, Becky, let's go ahead and let's dive into some questions from our fans. Can you read us the first question we got?
Sure thing, Mark. Our first question comes from a listener who asks, do you think the Mega Powers would have lasted longer if it weren't for the involvement of Miss Elizabeth? That's a great question. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I think so. Yes, I think their tension would have been the tension would have happened regardless, right? They would have butted heads and they would have collided because they're both vying for that top spot. I think it would have gone on longer. With Miss Elizabeth, certainly accelerated that tension.
Yeah, I think you're right. The competition between two huge personalities like Hogan and Savage would have eventually led to a clash. But without the Elizabeth factor, it might have been a slower burn, with more focus on their professional rivalry.
Yeah,
The
for
dynamic.
sure, for sure. That's a really good question. All right, let's take our next question, Becky. Read us the next question we got from our fans.
All right, our next question comes from a listener who's curious about the aftermath. They ask, after the mega powers exploded, what do you think was the most significant impact on each of their careers? That's a deep one. What's your take, Mark?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think Macho Man was a made man after that, both as a face in WrestleMania 4, as a heel at WrestleMania 5. I think he was a made man. It solidified him as one of the all-time greats. It also put Hogan back in the driver's seat, and Hulkamania surely wasn't over just yet. So I think it was more important for Macho Man at that point than it was for Hogan from a career perspective. What do you think?
I agree with you. For Macho Man, this storyline and the subsequent heel turn really elevated him to another level. It showcased his range as a performer, solidifying his legacy as one of the all time greats. For Hogan, it was more of a return to form, reaffirming his spot at the top and giving Hulkamania another boost.
Absolutely. All right, as we're winding down here, running out of time, Becky, let's take a final question from our fans.
All right, our final question comes from someone wondering about legacy. They ask, how do you think the explosion of the mega powers influenced future wrestling storylines? That's a big one. What do you think, Mark?
Ooh, I love that question. I think, like I said earlier in our podcast, that this is one of the greatest storylines, if not the greatest, in wrestling history. It paved the road and set the stage for all storylines to come, that time is of the essence. And this storyline played out for over a year, or about a year, until it came to fruition. So patience is a virtue. It's all about the slow build, the subtle movements and hints we got from, like the Macho Man, right? Giving Hulk Hogan a look at each of the pay-per-views or some little nuance happening. It really, really taught the art and essence of storytelling for wrestlers to come. How about you, Becky? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more, Mark. The Mega Powers storyline really set the gold standard for long term storytelling in wrestling. It showed how effective a slow build can be, drawing fans in and making every interaction, every match feel significant. It also showed the importance of character development and the impact of personal stakes in a storyline. Wrestling storylines that came after often tried to replicate that magic, using similar elements of betrayal, friendship, and intense personal conflict. It was a masterclass in how to engage an audience over the long haul.
Absolutely, absolutely, Becky. Well said. Well said. All right, well, that's going to do it for us here today, guys. Thank you for joining Becky and I at the AI Wrestling Podcast. We will see you same time next week. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone. It was a blast diving into wrestling history with you all. See you next week.